Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. Again, we are touching on issues which concern the THA and which, as I've said repeatedly, are not just THA issues, they're not just Tobago issues, but they are actually national issues. So we are fairly clear that Section 36 of the THA Act allows the current Chief Secretary, Mr. Ancil Dennis, to continue in office as Chief Secretary unless and until a new Chief Secretary is appointed or if he is reappointed as Chief Secretary. We're also clear that the Deputy Chief Secretary, Joel Jack, remains as Deputy Chief Secretary, and that again is by Section 36 of the THA Act. Section 36 of the THA Act is also even more interesting because it seems to allow for the secretaries, and by extension that would also expand and include the assistant secretaries. It seems to allow them to also remain in office and continue to hold their titles, positions, powers, authorities, and duties as secretaries and assistant secretaries during this interregnum, this period of holding over. So when one looks at Section 36.3 of the THA Act, it would appear for the record that persons such as Hayden Spencer continues as Secretary of Food Production. It would appear that Mr. Jomo Pitt continues as Secretary of Sport and Youth Affairs. It would appear that Mr. Kelvin Charles continues as Secretary of Innovation, Education and Energy. It would appear also that Marsha Osmond continues as Assistant Secretary in the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy. It would appear that Sheldon Cunningham continues as Assistant Secretary of Infrastructure, Quarries and the Environment. It would appear also that Shomari Hector continues as Assistant Secretary in the Division of Tourism, Culture and Transportation. It appears also that Kwesi Devines continues as Secretary of Infrastructure, Quarries and the Environment. It would appear also that Nadine Stewart continues as Assistant Secretary in the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development. Now, while that may be the strict legal position, I think we have to be mature, responsible, and honest about this. This clearly was never the intention of the legislature. The legislature did not intend that persons can hold over in these positions forever, while not even being members of the assembly anymore. Because if you notice, the names that I called out, Nadine Stewart, Kwesi Devines, Sheldon Cunningham, Shomari Hector, Marsha Osmond, Kelvin Charles, and Jomo Pitt, and Hayden Spencer, they are no longer even members of the assembly. So we need to be very clear on that, because when you look at the THA Act, upon the dissolution, these people were no longer members of the assembly. The Section 36 seeks to preserve the offices of Chief Secretary, Deputy Chief Secretary, Secretaries, and, as I say, by extension, Assistant Secretaries, even though that's not specifically mentioned there. But under the rules of legislative interpretation, the Assistant Secretaries I am suggesting would also be covered. So the point is, while technically you can say that, look, Kelvin Charles remains as Secretary of Education, I think what we have to do, we have to call upon these persons to tender their resignations from these portfolios in the public interest, because it cannot be fair or right that you are no longer even a member of the assembly and you are continuing in that post. So this is a totally separate argument from the persons such as the Chief Secretary, the Deputy Chief Secretary, Ms. Tracy Davidson Celestin, and the others who actually won their seats and are clearly members of the assembly because they were sworn in yesterday. So we're not dealing with those. We're talking about those who did not contest or did not win their seats and who are clearly no longer members of the assembly. So I think from a moral and ethical and even from a common sense and logical standpoint, it could not be that these persons ought to continue to draw the salary of secretary to enjoy the perks of office as secretary, to wield the power and authority as secretary or assistant secretary when they are not even members of the assembly anymore. So I think the best alternative would be if these persons, that's Kelvin Charles, Marsha Osmond, Sheldon Cunningham, Shomari Hector, the Mr. Kwesi Devines, Nadine Stewart, if these persons would voluntarily, and Mr. Jomo Pitt and Hayden Spencer, if these persons would voluntarily tender their resignations from their portfolios, you have Mr. Hayden Spencer, his portfolio is Secretary of Food Production. Mr. Jomo Pitt, Secretary of Sport and Youth Affairs. You have Kelvin Charles, Secretary of Education, Innovation and Energy. You have Marsha Osman, Assistant Secretary in the Division of Education, Innovation and Energy. You have Sheldon Cunningham, Assistant Secretary of Infrastructure, Quarries and the Environment. You have Shomari Hector, Assistant Secretary in the Division of Tourism, Culture and Transportation. You have Kwesi Devine, Secretary of Infrastructure, Quarries and the Environment, and you have Nadine Stewart, Assistant Secretary in the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development. So I am making the call today publicly to all these persons to voluntarily tender their resignations from these portfolios and offices in the interest of the public, in the interest of the THA, in the interest of the people of Tobago, and in the interest of Trinidad and Tobago. So I am repeating that call for Nadine Stewart to tender her resignation as Assistant Secretary in the Division of Health, Wellness and Family Development. I'm asking Kwesi Devines to tender his resignation as Secretary of Infrastructure, Quarries and the Environment. I'm asking for Shomari Hector to tender his resignation as Assistant Secretary in the Division of Tourism, Culture and Transportation. I'm asking for Sheldon Cunningham to tender his resignation as Assistant Secretary of Infrastructure, Quarries and the Environment. I'm asking for Marsha Osmond to tender her resignation as Assistant Secretary in the Division of Education. I'm asking for Kelvin Charles to tender his resignation as Secretary of Education. I'm asking for Jomo Pitt to tender his resignation as Secretary of Sport and Youth Affairs. And I'm asking for Hayden Spencer to tender his resignation as Secretary of Food Production, Forestry and Fisheries. That, I think, would be the best way forward in terms of the people of Tobago and the national population accepting the continuance in office, the holding over of basically what is supposed to be an interim caretaker position. So while I say we are not going to seek to ask that those who have been validly elected give up their portfolios, because the law under Section 36 clearly shows that they continue, I think from a moral, ethical, logical standpoint, those who did not contest the elections or contested and lost ought to do the principled thing, ought to do the right thing, and voluntarily step down. If they do not do so, my next call would be upon Ancil Dennis as Chief Secretary to advise the President to revoke those appointments. So I hope it does not come to that, and I hope the people of Tobago and the people of Trinidad and Tobago understand the legal implications, but understand also the social, moral and ethical implications of having persons who are not even members of the Assembly continuing to draw the large salaries of Secretary or Assistant Secretary and to continue in office holding those positions and portfolios when they are not even members of the Assembly anymore. So while we understand the strict interpretation of the law under Section 36, we say in the bigger picture here for Tobago and for Trinidad and Tobago is for these persons to voluntarily resign their positions, and if they don't, then we're asking that Ancil Dennis, in his capacity as Chief Secretary, I will then make another call at that stage. If it is that these persons don't voluntarily resign, I'll be making a call for Mr. Ancil Dennis in his position as Chief Secretary to advise the President to revoke those appointments, because it cannot continue. It is not something that I think the nation is going to be willing to tolerate, that you're paying these salaries and allowing these persons to continue to hold the perks of office, the powers, authority of office, when they are not even members of the Assembly. And I'm very clear, I'm making the distinction between those persons, and I'm calling the names specifically. That's Mr. Hayden Spencer, Mr. Jomo Pitt, Mr. Kelvin Charles, Miss Marsha Osmond, Mr. Sheldon Cunningham, Mr. Shomari Hector, Mr. Kwesi Devines, and Miss Nadine Stewart Phillips. Those persons who are no longer members of the Assembly. I am saying they should do the honourable thing, and they should therefore demit office from their secretary positions and their assistant secretary positions. So that's what we're asking to be done in this circumstance, and we hope that they do so, and that this situation, which is an unprecedented imbroglio and debacle facing us all, can at least be able to start to find some resolution in easing us out of this conundrum in which we've all found ourselves due to the shortcomings of the legislation. So, lastly, just to conclude, Section 36 makes it clear that they can continue in office and they are legally able to do so, but we're saying from a moral, ethical, and logical position, they should not.